Excellent, everybody. Good morning. We're going to be diving right into Microsoft Sentinel this morning. So as you can see on my screen right now, we've got a little bit of a deck prepared. So we're going to go over some of the overview sections of what Sentinel can do, some of the things as far as how its native integration works. And then after that, just so everybody understands how this is going to flow, we do have a demo where Todd is going to dive into the actual Sentinel piece, and you can see what some of the dashboards and panes look like and talk about some configuration. So going on to our first question here, what is Microsoft Sentinel? So Sentinel is Microsoft's response to the SIEM and SOAR solution that's out there today with regards to a lot of third-party providers out there that are providing the same solutions. This is a cloud-native solution. It is built on Microsoft Azure and is also built on the backbone of the Azure Monitor tool, which many of you have used probably in the past. One of the biggest things overall is that it does provide a centralized location for all of your security threat detection and monitoring. So you can go through undetected threats. It can go hunting for you through artificial intelligence. It also does utilize Microsoft Analytics for this. With that being said, it does use Microsoft Analytics workspaces to take a look at the data as it's pumped into Sentinel, which can be from multiple different sources. We'll cover those here in a little bit as far as what exactly it can integrate with and how that actually works. But you can use it from, identity perspectives, from an Azure AD and Active Directory on-premise. You can use it from devices and applications. Infrastructure-wise, that does include both on-premise data center infrastructure, third-party clouds, as well as Microsoft native cloud itself. As far as the investigation side, it absolutely works from an artificial intelligence basis and taps into the logging that happens that's pumped into Microsoft Sentinel from the various aspects of how it's configured. What I mean by that is if you're going into the environment and you add, integrations into your on-premise environment from an appliance perspective and from an Active Directory perspective or server perspective, it will actually start combing through those logs, taking a look at some of the behavioral-based things that are happening there, and can actively go hunt for vulnerabilities, attack vectors, or things that may not have been known in the environment ahead of time. Now, this all culminates into the SOAR solution from the Sentinel side, which is the rapid response. And there are a lot of different ways that can be happening. Now, Microsoft obviously offers the wide gamut of manual remediation as well as orchestration and automation of those tasks. Many of you that are familiar with Microsoft System Center and Operations Manager, more commonly known as SCCM and SCOM, you'll notice a lot of parallels as we start talking about this, as they built some of that infrastructure based on that initial development of System Center. And even when we start going through the demo, you might notice some of the dashboards look very similar to SCOM. Now, a lot of you might ask, what would be the rapid response as far as a tiered level approach? We will go over that in greater detail in a little bit later slide, but just know that you have full customization over that process. You can automate things that may necessarily be lower tier issues and leave the manual stuff for your higher priority tasks. Okay. A lot of challenges that come up today. Not just SOC challenges, but challenges overall. A lot of these are very applicable for a lot of organizations. Some of these I'm going to call out are the high volume of noisy alerts. For those of you that have used Microsoft products in the past, you know that if you don't dedicate an FTE to kind of combing through and fine-tuning those alerts, they can inundate you, and eventually you get enough fatigue on it that people just don't pay attention to alerts anymore. Threats are getting a lot more sophisticated these days. We hear all about all the new attacks that are happening against, a wide variety of industries. And this is Microsoft's answer to that. Automation is also a big thing, as well as the short skill supply from your security staff, being able to keep up with all these new threats that are coming out or new attack vectors as they get, developed with new types of technologies as they come out. One that isn't necessarily listed here, but I like to call out because it's a very immediate one that's happened this year, is obviously the new requirements around insurance companies being able to do cybersecurity insurance. With these new insurance companies are now having the requirements of things like MFA being deployed into the environment to even be able to insure your organizations. Those are things that Sentinel can help you uncover and ultimately provide recommendations or automate the remediation of that if need be. So Sentinel overall comes in a 4-phased approach on how it actually does things. And that starts with collecting of your data. Now we'll go into a little bit more detail as far as what collecting your data means, but basically you can pick sources in the environment and it doesn't really matter what the source is. There are customized connectors, but there are also generalized ones that can be used for basic log alerting to be able to ingest as much data as you want to into Sentinel based on how you set up those rules. Then what it'll do is it'll start ingesting all of that data and combing through it all. Now, Sentinel also has the ability to look at your network and look at other things that are connected to that network to be able to start doing that AI investigation, which is the next phase. After it's looked at that data, it's going to start to investigate what it sees in the logs and what it sees in the network traffic activity and the behavioral analysis of what's happening in Azure and your on-premise environment and start to investigate things that it might come up with. Now, that phase I'd like to pause for a minute and just kind of give a little bit more detail on. There is going to be a pane that you're going to get, and you will see this later in the demo presentation, where it will show all of the issues that are going to be, recommended for. It'll say severity level. These are the recommendations that Sentinel is going to make that you remediate. Now, whether you respond to those is completely up to you. Now, I say that because there are going to be definitely issues for those of you that, again, calling back to SCCM and SCOM, that might call out issues that you are well known are configured a specific way because your environment or your business practices require something to be maybe not necessarily Microsoft best practice, but still be Microsoft supported. Sentinel's not going to deprecate or differentiate from those. It's going to basically give you a recommendation on everything. Then on the response side, you can then configure the automation and or manual response on how you would like Sentinel to respond and or report on that. So it does give you limitless ability to scale with the cloud. So you can pump as much data into it as possible. I will say, and we'll get into cost analysis and management here in a little bit, but the Microsoft Sentinel product is not a licensing based product. It's not something that you're going to pay for from your typical type of Azure resource, which is usually utilization based, which is for any of you that have been in the Azure space, know you pay for your VMs on a per month and per utilization cost. Or if you do it more on a PaaS service, it's based on those PaaS service offerings. Sentinel is more storage based. So it's going to, the charge for that is basically going to be incremental based on the amount of storage on the ingestion of logs. We will get more into some of those metrics here in a little bit. One key point I do want to point out on the slide for everybody that's kind of a new addition in the last 6 months is any data that you bring in from Office 365 into your Sentinel deployments is considered free. It does not go against your deployment cycle for log analytics workspaces. It does not go against your storage quota. So anything you pull in from that particular environment is considered free and you can analyze it as much as you'd like. And obviously you can integrate it with your existing tools. We have a few diagrams to show you how that works, but you can integrate it with your on-premise environment as well, or any type of third-party appliances you might be running as OVA appliances in Azure or in your on-premise environment as physical devices. So let's dive a little bit into the actual Sentinel architecture. So the architecture as a whole, moving on to the next slide, is not an architectural base where you'll see a traditional architectural diagram. There's no server deployment here. There's no necessarily a huge amount of networking connectivity that needs to happen. It is all based on the Azure Monitor platform. So there's no infrastructure setup or maintenance. You turn the feature set on, and then you configure what you want Sentinel to monitor and what you want to ingest from it. It is considered a full SIEM solution. So you access it from the Azure portal. For those of you that have, used Azure in the past, it's very similar to Azure Security Center. And to put a little bit of a pin on that, Azure Security Center actually plays a major role in how Sentinel works. It's going to pull data from Azure Monitor when applicable, but a lot of the data is also gathered from Azure Security Center. And you can scale it to whatever you want to go with. Now, I highly recommend everybody from a cost perspective or even just a general planning perspective to plan out how you want this to work should you decide to take a dip into Sentinel. And that is, security alerts is what Sentinel is going to be looking for. So as you pump data into it, you want to make sure that it's security only data. You don't want to inundate Sentinel with a bunch of logs of, how you're divvying out subnet information with regards to DHCP scopes or things like that. That's just going to bog it down and honestly costs organizations a bit more. Now, I call it Azure Monitor because maybe a few of you guys have been using this already. Azure Monitor has been around for quite a long time. And it's used as a monitoring solution that feeds data into Azure Security Center. It's an agent-based deployment that you deploy on your VMs or your physical servers, and it monitors them from an OS perspective as well as a hardware perspective. Gives that data into Azure Security Center and then gives you feedback. It's the same basis model for Azure Sentinel, although it goes a step further with the AI analytics piece of it to make things a little bit easier for you to manage. Also gives you that single pane of glass to be able to show where are your threats, where are they happening from, what kind of threats are you running into, and what kind of behaviors are you running into, especially from an identity perspective. But that does mean that to deploy it on premise, it does mean you have to do an agent install to be able to do that. But it is done over an encrypted channel, and all data pumped up into the cloud is encrypted, both in transit and at rest. This next diagram kind of gives you a general overview of how Sentinel actually works on the back end. As you can see, it's collecting data from numerous sections on here on the left-hand side. It can be applications, it can be user-based tied in Active Directory, it can be infrastructure devices. One of the great questions I get a lot from clients is, well, we've already got some security solutions. You might be running SolarWinds. You might be running, Palo Altos or Fortinets on the environment or various other devices or solutions. That is perfectly fine. You can integrate those directly into Sentinel and use Sentinel as your single pane of glass. It might also be beneficial to know that Microsoft does have a transition plan should you wish to, start to transition everything into Sentinel, which is always a nice thing to do if you want to centralize everything on a Microsoft standpoint. Now, once it's in there, that middle section on this particular slide will show the various areas that you can utilize. So you can use the dashboarding for visibility. That is probably one of the biggest things. I get a lot of questions, especially from the CEO levels and the C-level execs, is how do I visualize this? And Todd will show this later in his demo, but that dashboard will give you that single pane of glass to not just go, here's a list of all the errors and all the issues and security threats we found, but it actually gives you that single pane of glass of showing you your trends. Like you saw, and I will back up one slide just to show, this trend listing you see here on the right will show you how many alerts you're getting on a period of time, where they're coming from on that global map, and general threat levels and intensities based on that global map. Then you can then customize this to use the investigation and hunt through the machine learning analytics pieces. This is where the machine learning and AI piece comes in. This is not an automatic thing. Some people get a little scared about using AI and data and analytics as they go forward to find out, what are they looking into? What kind of data is Microsoft gathering? You have control over the whole process. If you want to keep it manual and be able to have Sentinel just gather all of the data, show it all, and then the manual remediation process is something your organization wants, you can absolutely do that. On the flip side, if you want it to be fully automated and configure automations except for maybe tier 1 outages, then you can absolutely do that. Now, one of the nice things that Todd will show you here in a little bit, and this is something that Microsoft included in the last 2 months, is now there are playbooks. Microsoft always had the capability since Sentinel launched to be able to create your own playbooks. But a new addition is now they've added over 200 pre-baked in templatized playbooks that you can use for various solutions and or third-party solutions that are out there to be able to do some of that automation without spending hours upon hours or days configuring that automation. One nice thing I do want to call out to everybody is the automation doesn't just have to sit with Sentinel. You can integrate it with other tools like ServiceNow and other things like that to be able to run those orchestrated playbooks, to run the automated remediation against other tool sets, to prompt them to start doing those remediations if you want to as well. So it is fully integratable with anything you'd like to tie into it. Then we kind of talk about just the collection of data overall and how it integrates. I do want to make sure I spend some time talking about this from an integration standpoint. So anything you have on premise can integrate with Sentinel. It doesn't matter how it is. Now, the way they integrate might change a little bit. So you have pre-wired integrations for all the Microsoft solutions. If you're using anything in Azure, if you're using anything in 365, even if you're using, a Skype for Business server on premise or an old Exchange server, there are integrators and connectors set up with Sentinel to be able to comb through that. Now, there are caveats to that. I'm not going to say that, Sentinel is going to go utilize an Exchange 2003 server. That's getting a little bit too old. So it needs to be relevant and updated and with inside support of Microsoft. The connectors with partner solutions. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Your Palo Altos, your Fortinets, your Cisco devices, SolarWinds. There are pre-canned connectors in there that you can use that set up everything for you. And all you got to do is flip the switch, turn it on, and let it go. But I do want to call out, and Todd will show you this a little bit when we get into the template of the connectors, that there are standard log format supports. So if you've got a custom solution that you built out, or you've got a solution that isn't supported by Microsoft technically, you can do a standard log format supporter with a connector to be able to pull those logs in and still be able to ingest that data and analyze it, even if Microsoft hasn't quite developed a connector for it yet. All right, moving on from there. And this shows you some of those analytic rules. So this is an example of a dashboard. You'll see some of this during our live demo. And again, for those of you who are worked in the System Center world, this might look really familiar to you because they kept the dynamics and the way it looks very much the same. And this is where you can dive into what active rules you've got applied, what errors you're running into, and what type of severity that you're running into on those. And you can customize that severity. If Sentinel's giving you a high level severity and you know that that's not a business level threat, high level severity, you can customize that alerting to, although it would still show as high in this dashboard, the alert that you would get would be customized to show the severity based on your business needs. So let's talk a little bit about the automated incident response, and that would be the SOAR solution that Sentinel provides. I touched base a little bit on this earlier, but it is a tiered-based approach and a fully customizable one at best. This is something that Microsoft does recommend as far as the general model that everybody should go into when thinking about Sentinel. Now, on this model, you might notice Microsoft is very much recommending that you automate as much as you can for all well-known attacks and everything across all the tiers. That is definitely what you should be looking at across the board. But let's be honest, everybody knows who's been doing IT long enough that you've got various levels of your severities. You got your tier 3, your tier 2, and your tier 1. Those high-speed remediations of those tier 1s, which oftentimes ends up being telecom systems and email systems, those are going to require some manual process. And even if they don't, you might want your team to be manually engaged in that process to be able to remediate. That is perfectly fine. You can customize that and make it to where it's a manual approach, but Sentinel will alert on those issues for you. On the second hand, if you've got a smaller IT staff, it might just be you and one other person on your IT team. Automate as much as you can, and then allow Sentinel to report to you on how it went and if any issue remediation needs to happen afterwards if an automated response wasn't available. But you can do those deeper analyses. You can do, proactive hunting, everything that's listed in this tiered approach. And if you want to go higher than that and go 5 tiers, 10 tiers, you can certainly do that as well. This should be the default approach that everybody goes into when looking at an Azure Sentinel trial or even just kind of looking at things in general. And then detecting threats. So this is very much exactly what's going to be going on as far as when you hit that analyze phase. So when you hit that analyze phase and the data is already in there, I mentioned the machine learning and AI, and some of the stuff we did cover on previous slides. But one thing I do want to call out is that big point there in blue, that reduce alert fatigue by up to 90%. I have done numerous SCOM implementations with numerous clients, and one of the biggest complaints we've got overall, and even Microsoft has too, is that you get inundated with alerts. Like it sends, several an hour, if not more than that, depending upon the size of organization. And if you don't have somebody managing that or managing the deployment on an active FTE basis, it's almost too much to deal with on an overhead perspective. But that's one thing that the AI does as well. It's going to look at how these alerts are coming in. It's going to look at how the data and analysis is working, and it's going to naturally reduce those alerts based on ones that it deems more severe. Now, you can also customize that. I don't want everybody to think that Microsoft's going to start suppressing messages that are super important. They're not going to do that. It is a collaborative response where you would go in and configure some rules and then configure the behavioral, and then Microsoft's going to start asking you questions over time to say, hey, are these alerts relevant? And if you say no, it's going to start to suppress those things. You can still go look at it in the dashboard, but you're not going to get alerted in your email every 5 seconds that you've got a new alert going on. Obviously, the big goal here, everybody, is to make sure that you're getting the right alerts, the relevant ones, and the ones you need to respond to, and not all of the, white noise that you get typically from alerting systems. Investigation of threats is also a big one. This is another pane that you can take a look at, and this gives you a visual representation of how a threat might come in. So when a threat is analyzed, and in this case, it'd be a failed logins from multiple locations, it's going to show you what's happening, what they're accessing, and how they're accessing it. So you can see a user there in blue is trying to access multiple things, and you've got failed logon anomaly attempts. Then you've got suspicious PowerShell things, and you can see that that's pulling out to multiple services there on the right. That's representation that not only you can use for investigation and forensics, but you can use it for post-mortem reports and or reporting to the business in general to show them, hey, here's what happened, here's what Sentinel showed us to do, and here's the remediation that took place, either by those pre-built notebooks or by the manual response that was done based on the severity and or the customization that you've done overall with regards to Sentinel. And that's just a very few things that it can do. The idea here today, guys, is to give you a general overview of what Sentinel can do and address some of the major questions that we get. Big ones such as, can you run Sentinel on premise? You absolutely can. Can you use it as your primary SIEM solution and source solution for everything in your data center, regardless of where it's located? Yes, as long as you set it up and set all the connectors up there, that is a solution that you can do. So we're going to transition here in a minute into the Sentinel demo and some cost management discussions in there. But there are some ways to keep the costs at a minimum and make sure that you are getting the security that you want, but not necessarily having the overrun of charges that cloud solutions can do if you don't put the proper parameters on them. One thing I do want to mention, and we can get later into detail if anybody has any questions about this, but Microsoft Sentinel does offer a 31-day free trial that you're able to use. It is completely free. It doesn't even charge you for the log analytics workspace or the data that's ingested, with the exception of it has a limit of 10 gigabytes per day of ingested data. As long as you're under that threshold, it is completely free for 31 days, and you're welcome to continue utilizing it after the fact and set up a tiered pricing structure. Or you can say this isn't for me and move on to your third-party solutions if that's what you'd rather do. So I want to appreciate everybody's time and listening through my little presentation here. I am going to turn the time over to Todd Rhodes, my Azure architect, to go through a demo of what Azure Sentinel actually looks like and some of the capabilities of what it can do in a live demo.
Thank you, Mike. Let me go ahead and pull up Sentinel. So Mike kind of went over what Sentinel does. I want to show you guys what it looks like under the hood. So as Mike said, this is the Sentinel dashboard, and I get a kind of a quick overview of what's going on in my environment. Like Mike said, I have data that I can look at visually and see exactly what's going on. What kind of alerts am I getting? When am I getting them? The other thing that I really want to show you guys, as Mike alluded to, is how we actually collect the data into Sentinel. So as Mike said, there's a lot of different pre-built connectors that we can use. One example is the other week I actually had a client. They had sonic wall firewalls, and we needed to be able to integrate them with Azure Sentinel. So what we did is we went ahead and went to the sonic wall connector, and each connector actually tells you exactly what you need to do to integrate it. So it's pretty easy to integrate with pretty much any third-party solution that you can find. As Mike alluded to, it also integrates with your on-premise devices. So a lot of people obviously have domain controllers and other Windows servers on-prem. It natively integrates with those. And one really cool thing you can do is send all of your security events from your Windows servers to Azure Sentinel. And one thing you can do is you can actually customize, what kind of events you want to send. As Mike said, you may not want to send all of your events. You may just want to send either errors or warnings. Right now, I have all my events just because this is a lab environment and I'm not generating very many events. Another thing that Mike alluded to is the common events connector, which you can use to pretty much integrate any device that has logs. So this common event format you can use to pull logs from any device, essentially. So it's very customizable with what logs you can send to Sentinel. So after you actually send your logs, the next step is you have to figure out what are you going to do with all that data. So Microsoft actually has a lot of pre-built analytics rules that you can apply, and most of them are scheduled where basically it runs a query every so often, however often you set it to, and if it returns data from that query, it automatically generates an incident from that query. So another a good option or good example is, let's say someone elevates their security rights in Azure AD. Basically, this query runs every 2 hours, and if that happens within the last 2 hours, it's going to generate an alert. And the next step, once you generate alert, is you have to figure out what you want to do with that alert. So that's where the automation that Michael was talking about kicks in. Once an alert is generated, like Mike said, you can run a custom playbook, or Microsoft has pre-built custom templates that you can use. So let's say you have a Cisco firewall. So you can search for Cisco, and these are all the automated responses you can have with your Cisco firewall. So basically you can deputize Sentinel to say, okay, if there's a malicious IP that I see on my Cisco firewall, I want you to block it immediately. Or if you want to customize your automation a little bit more, you can use logic apps, as Mike alluded to. So I have a logic app set up here, and it's just a test playbook. And basically all it does is every time there's an alert generated in Sentinel, it sends out an email. And I can customize the email. So right now I just have the events, the severity, the name of the actual alert, and then the entities involved. So that's whether it's a computer, what users are involved, what public IPs are involved, that will tell me that here. And then I also have a link to the incident URL. So when I get an email, I can click on that link and look at the actual investigation. And I'll show you guys what that looks like. Now, emailing is not the only thing you can do with this. There's so many options. Pretty much the sky's the limit with what you can do with your automated responses. One thing that's really cool is you can use Azure Automate. And with Azure Automate, you can actually run PowerShell scripts in Azure. So basically anything you can do in PowerShell, you can use to respond to your incidents. Another really cool thing you can do is you can call webhooks and REST APIs. So one thing I've done with this in the past is I had a client, they use ServiceNow as their for all their tickets. So basically all I did was I piped in the ServiceNow webhook, and then every time an incident was generated in Sentinel, it automatically forwarded to ServiceNow so they could manage it there. But like I said, there's so many automation options that the sky's the limit. The limit is your own imagination to what you can come up with, how you want to respond to an attack or an incident. Let me go ahead and show you guys kind of what an incident looks like once it's generated. So once I've generated an incident, I've set up my responses to that incident. I want to look at my actual incidents. So I like to filter my incidents here. So let's just look at high incidents. So I have 2 high incidents here that I generated myself. So basically I can look at these incidents at a 10,000 foot view here, or I can go to view full details and I can start that investigation process that Michael was talking about. So I can go ahead and click investigate. So in this case, it looks like I have 2 users that elevated their privileges in Azure AD. Now in our environment, this is expected behavior because we have privilege identity management, where basically our users have to request the right to be able to use their admin status. And that admin status is temporary. So every time someone requests admin status, I get an alert in Sentinel saying, hey, someone just elevated their privileges. So as I'm investigating, I can look at a person or a host computer if I have any computers or public IP address involved, and I can go ahead and click on related events, and it'll tell me everything that that person or entity has been doing. So that's part of the investigation process. Another really cool thing I can do is I can look at workbooks. So I have some pre-built workbooks here, but basically a workbook is a 10,000 foot view of your data. So if I want to see what my people are doing in Azure, I have a workbook for it. And this is a pre-built workbook by Microsoft. And I can look at it and see who's doing what. I can see who's deleting stuff, who's creating stuff, who's updating, what activities they're doing. So this is a 10,000 foot level view of what's going on in my Azure environments. And Microsoft has hundreds of pre-built Microsoft workbook templates that you can use to kind of look at what's going on in your environments. Another really cool thing you can do is you can set up hunting. So basically hunting is those same analytics queries that we talked about earlier, but these, instead of running on a schedule, I can just run them on command. So let's say I'm having issues with Azure AD, I can just search for Azure AD. And these are all the pre-built queries that I can run against my Azure AD logs to see what's going on. And another cool thing is if I want to, I can create my own queries. So if I wanted to create a custom query that I wanted to run on demand, or if I had someone on my team who didn't know how to use the log analytics queries, then I could create a query for them and then they could just run it on demand here in this pane of glass without having to even understand exactly how the query works. Another thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about is kind of the cost. So as Mike alluded to, there's several different ways that you can handle costs. If you want to, if you're ingesting a lot of data, then you can actually pay per day. So you can pay up front and say, okay, I'm going to ingest at least 100 gigs a day. So I'm going to go on the 100 gigs a day plan and go ahead and apply that. Now, for most people, you're probably not going to ingest 100 gigs a day. So you're probably going to go on the pay-as-you-go plan. But as Mike alluded to, one of the problems with Sentinel is that there's no way to cap your data. It just takes whatever connectors you've connected to it, and it just pulls in that data and you're charged for it. So one of the things I've come up with to solve that problem is, I don't have it in this environment, but I've written it for other clients. I actually have a custom rule that I've set up that runs every 24 hours. And it tells them how much data they've ingested in the last 24 hours. And I actually got with them and said, okay, how much do you want to spend per day on Sentinel? And I did the calculations and how many gigs that would be per day. And if they ever go over that threshold, then they automatically get a Sentinel incident that says, hey, you guys are going over your threshold. You may want to look at your data connectors and look at the data you're pulling in and see if there's a way that you can minimize some of that data. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the AI portion that Mike alluded to. So another thing you can do is you can actually set up entity behavior. And basically what this does is it looks at your user's behavior and also your machine's behavior. And it looks for any anomalies, and it automatically generates incidents out of those. So for example, if you have a user that starts logging on at 3 a.m. and starts running random PowerShell scripts, and they don't normally do that, the AI is going to see that and be like, generate an incident from it. And you can also, even with the AI, you can also add playbooks to, if it generates any of its own incidents, what does it do with those incidents, and how does it respond? So like I said, Sentinel is very simple on its face, but there's so much customization that you can do at every level that it can get very complicated. Or you can keep it simple and use all of the Microsoft provided templates. or you can dig down into the weeds and get as, have as much analytics as you need for your environments. That concludes the demo portion. I think we're ready to start the Q&A session now.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Todd. Got a few questions out there if people would like to hang around. So I don't know if this should be better directed towards Michael or Todd, but someone had posed a question about differences, if any, around Azure Sentinel and Azure Monitor. Can anybody speak to that?
Yeah, I can talk to that one. So it's actually pretty simple. Azure Monitor is a gathering tool. Like I said during the presentation, it has been around for a while. It is used to collect all of that data. So if you're not doing a connector that's native for one of the solutions, and instead you're going to collect something from an agent-based solution that will gather OS information and hardware information based on the server and/or workstation it's loaded on, Monitor will just gather that data, and it will present it to you through the Log Analytics workspace and through Azure Security Center. And what that does is Sentinel's built on the backbone of that to do then that investigate and AI analytics against the data that Azure Monitor is collecting.
Great, thanks, Michael. Hopefully that addressed the question. Another one out there, talk about transitioning. What if a client already has an existing SIEM provider that they've implemented?
It's a great question. I get asked that a lot. So a lot of you guys might be having contracts currently with your current SIEM providers and or security solutions. Microsoft encourages a hybrid approach in that case. So if you've got a solution, you've got a current contract in, and say it's a year, 2, 3 years, integrate it with Sentinel. Let Sentinel be that single pane of glass for you. Let it work as far as that automated response side of things. And that gives you a great time to be able to take a look at it and go, hey, Sentinel's providing everything that we need. Let's go ahead and maybe transition off of that third-party solution that you're using and go Microsoft native. That's obviously what Microsoft's aiming for. They want your business, and that's rightfully so because they do a great job with their products. However, I'm not going to, drink from the Microsoft Kool-Aid on my entire answer, and I'll also provide that there might be some instances where your third-party solution is providing a feature set that is much better than what Sentinel can provide for your unique situation, in which case you can simply turn down Sentinel and continue utilizing your current on-premise thing without having to transition any type of contracts. You can operate in that hybrid state while you're testing everything. And that is exactly what that 31-day trial is designed for.
Got it. Lastly, looks like the last one I see out there. Talk about the implementation process a bit, if you would, in terms of time. What does it take from a client to get Sentinel up and running in their environment?
Yeah, Todd, do you want to address that one?
Sure. Actually, that one is a huge caveat because it all depends on what kind of data connectors they have. Most clients, it takes probably about 6 weeks, because what we have to do first, like I said, we have to set up the data connectors. And then once we set up the data connectors, we have to fine tune that data. So as Mike said, a lot of SIEM solutions, they're very noisy. So the first step we do after we set up the data connectors is we fine tune some of those alerts. And depending on how much data you have coming in, that fine tuning process can take a while. That makes sense.
Great. Thanks, Todd. I think that's all we have. We'd like to once again thank everybody for joining us today. Michael, thank you. Todd, thank you for your time in putting this together. We hope that you found some of the information contained here useful. And if you have any additional questions, check us out on the web, www.oakwoodsys.com, and you can get in touch with our cloud and infrastructure team there. Other than that, I think we're ready to let you go. Have a great Thursday and hope to see you soon. Thank you.